everybody, and welcome back to another week of the Let's Talk Social Innovation podcast. I hope you've had an amazing start to your week, but if not, we can kickstart that right here. I'm your host, Ian Kahinde, and y'all know the deal. Usually, it is time for the bulletin board, but in this case, as it is finals week, nothing to worry about, no events going on, no need for extra blab from me. We're just going to get straight into the meat of the episode. This week, y'all, I have the incredible privilege to speak with Nicholas Haberman and Robert Scherrer. Robert Scherrer, the executive director of the AIU, and Nicholas Haberman, coordinator of civic engagement and anti-hate education at AIU. How are we feeling today?
Feeling great.
Good, thank you.
Appreciate you being with us.
So as always, y'all, as we do in every single episode, we'll be going through Nick and Robert's upbringings, what made them the men that they are today. We'll be talking about their careers, how they got started at the AIU, and the work that they currently do. In case you do not know what an intermediate unit is, we will be covering that as well. As always, we'll be going through the best life advice that we can pass on. We'll have our artist spotlight as always, and the second half, we'll be talking about the topic of teaching empathy. But anyways, y'all, bygones be bygones. Everything else aside. Nick, take me from the beginning.
Oh, my goodness. All right. Well, I was born in Pittsburgh, Pennsylvania, grew up in Etna, went to Shaler Area High School, ended up at the University of Pittsburgh a couple of times. And during that stint, I did some internships at the Carnegie Museum of Natural History and the British Museum of Natural History in London, and ended up coming back to Pitt for education grad school. So that's like the full story in 30 seconds.
So what made you want to become an educator?
I think there's two types of experiences that every teacher seems to have. It's the experience of, I want to be a teacher so that so I can be like this amazing teacher I had, and then everyone has those moments where they think, oh, if I were a teacher someday, I would never do that. I would do that differently. So I had some absolutely amazing teachers in my life that I wanted to copy, including some family members, my aunts, my uncles, my mom, my grandma, great-grandparents, come from a family of educators. And then when I was going to school, I had a lot of teachers that were in the last couple years of their career. And some of them were definitely like, how can I put my heart and soul into these last couple years? And some of them were like, I'm kind of done with this. And I thought all right, well, we're having a bit of a changing of the guard here. And so when I got hired, there were 60 teachers that retired that year. There was mass retirements in the early 2000s, and it kind of everybody turned over. So I was part of that next generation.
So let me ask you this. Your great-grandfather was the president of the Heinz Union.
Yeah.
And then, of course, the teaching, there's teaching in your bloodline, I guess I would say. Family of educator, and then you have the union experience on the other side. How do those two things come together to make the man that we see in front of us?
Yeah, I mean, I had a third thing in there, too, is a big part of my job is talking and teaching about the Universal Declaration of Human Rights, and one of those 30 human rights that we all have because we're a human being is the right to join a union, and I definitely grew up with that in southwestern Pennsylvania. So growing up, it was always, you can say the formality of the union, but informally it was take care of each other, look out for each other. Grew up in an environment where you really needed people to take care of one another at all levels. So the young people helping out, shoveling the old folks' driveways, and you also had people like my parents' friends would drive me places, and you get that mentality of taking care of one another, and that's really what a union at its core is a group of people taking care of one another to make sure that they got the best of what they can have. So growing up, on one half of my family, it was all tradespeople who came from a long line of working in the waterfront and other places in the south side at the steel mills, and then the other half, it was all educators. So growing up, my grandma, who was the son of this union leader, always talked about the importance of paying your dues, putting in your time, making sure you took care of people who were much older than you, because you would eventually be one of those people that you would need the younger workers to help you out and help take care of you. So words like, the stint, that was a word that I grew up with. Like, don't make the older folks look bad by working your butt off. Like, you don't need to make anybody look bad because we're all in this together. So the idea of collective bargaining was really strong in my house, of making sure that you do what's necessary to help out everybody get the best contract that you can get, because that gets you those three things everybody needs: good wages, good hours, and good working conditions. So growing up, no matter what organization I worked for or what organizations my family's worked for, it was always, how do we make sure we get the best wages we can, the best hours we can, the best working conditions we can.
So you feel like you still have a strong sense of community now?
I do. Yeah, I do, for sure. And I work with a lot of independent contractors, consultants, and even though it's not a formal union, everybody has that mentality of, if something's not going well, you got to talk about it. If we got to come to a resolution, we have to, even though we're not formally going into like arbitration, we're following that process of, what are you upset about? What am I upset about? Let's come to a consensus. Let's come to a resolution and move forward together. So even though not everybody I work with is in an association of some kind, that kind of thinking still unites us and brings us together. And it's a strong history in Pittsburgh. You can't leave it.
I think that's great. I feel like for a lot of people watching and listening, as time has gone on in the United States, I feel as though we've moved away from like a central community. We live a lot. Our lives are in bubbles, and cooperation, coordination, I feel like they're at all-time lows. So I think it's great that you still have that here while a lot of us are, I guess, communities drying out in a sense,
I think educators are going to hold on to that till the end of time, because we have to. As you know, schools are challenging places to work in, because every year you get a new group of students that has a new set of needs and challenges. And if the educators don't come together to support those students in the best way possible, then the whole system collapses. So there is this kind of unspoken like social contract of, we're going to take care of each other so we can take care of them. And then they're going to grow up, and hopefully some of them enter the profession, and they're going to take care of us. So it's teachers have this uncanny ability to see the future a lot better than I think some other folks, because we see it every day right in front of us.
Well, I'm going to pivot over to my other great guest. Robert, take me from the beginning. Where do you hail from?
Sure. So we're here in the waterfront today at the AIU, and I grew up just a few miles south of here in Baldwin-Whitehall. I went to Baldwin High School and then matriculated on to IUP for my education degree, both my undergraduate and my master's, and then I ended up, just like Nick, at Pitt as well, where I received my doctorate in school leadership. And so when I think about sort of that journey, and some of the things that Nick was sharing, this idea of, seeing yourself within a larger community, and what does that look like, and how do not just your parents, but your families, your neighbors, how do they help shape sort of who you are and what you become? And so that's a little bit about my initial background.
So one thing that I have down on you is that you did not love school growing up. So how do you end up here?
So school is one of those things you went because you had to go, but the funny thing was, I always saw that there were things that I was going to do in the future, but I never really kind of maybe took school serious enough as much as I needed to. And once I got into high school, I got involved in a few more activities, and whether it's, types of organizations in schools that I found I could connect with. And you start to realize maybe that you take school a little bit more seriously moving on. But my plan was to go into business. I wanted to start my own business, and I was a business major in college. And because of a few interactions with a few people, all of a sudden realized that maybe education is the way that I want to go. And one of the best decisions that I've ever made in my life. I love just being part of this world where we're inspiring young people. We're empowering the adults to work with them in creative ways. That's just something that really speaks to me, and no regrets on the path at all.
So what interaction pushed you into education?
I was really trying to decide what my major was going to be. I was business undecided, and I was talking to someone in my dorm, And as we were talking, another student came over and asked a question about a class that we were in, and I was able to sort of explain it one way. And another student asked if a little bit later I had explained it in a little bit different way. And she jokingly said, "Well, you should become a teacher." And it just, so this light bulb kind of went off. Like, that would be really interesting, because as much as I love business, I could teach business. And then I would still have my summers where I could explore businesses that I might want to start as an entrepreneur. And then just realize that I loved it too much and just wanted to find other aspects other than being a teacher in education.
So now here we are full time.
Here we are.
So take me through your journey to the AIU, here, how we are here now. Take me through your career getting up to this point.
Yeah, so I went back to my high school and I taught at Baldwin High School. I taught courses in entrepreneurship, accounting, computers, and then someone tapped me on the shoulder one day and said, "You ever think about becoming a principal?" And so I spent time as an assistant principal in the Woodland Hills School District, then at the Peters Township School District. Went back to Woodland Hills as the co-principal at the high school, and then I went into the city, and I was principal at Alderdice High School for 2 years, and then had the incredible opportunity to be the founding principal of the Pittsburgh Science and Technology Academy right on the Pitt campus, which was just a phenomenal experience. And so I was there for 4 years, saw our first graduating class through, and then an opportunity presented itself at North Allegheny, where I was the assistant superintendent for a few years, and then the superintendent for 5 after that. Loved that job. It was a great place to be, but then this role here at the AIU became available, and I looked at sort of the reach and the scope of what the AIU can provide by serving all 42 school districts here in Allegheny County, outside the city, all the different community resources that we provided, our early childhood programs, and just thought, that's something that it's really exciting, because you really have an opportunity to just sort of impact this much broader perspective across the county. And so, again, the journey has been amazing. I've loved every stop along the way, and I absolutely love the work that we're doing here right now.
Now, one quote that I have you down saying is that being a good principal does not make you good in other roles. What type of challenges are there in terms of, I guess, pivoting leadership abilities in different roles?
Yeah, I think, as you move through education, what you realize is you can be a really good teacher, but some of the skills that make you a great teacher don't necessarily always translate to being a great principal. And a great principal doesn't always become a great superintendent. So the roles are a little bit different. The perspective is a little bit different. Now, you see a lot of people who are very good teachers become very good principals, become very good superintendents. So you see that, but it is different. And you need to sort of understand when you transition from one role to the next that your point of view is different. The way that you sort of impact people is a little bit different. As a teacher, I love that direct impact you had on young people. It was absolutely amazing. It's why you got up in the morning to do that work. But then when you sort of move into an administrative role, you realize, okay, you're not going to maybe have that depth of relationship with a student, but now I can impact a student body. I can impact the teachers that work with them every day. And so that scope changes a little bit as you move through some of those different seats.
Now, before we get too ahead of ourselves, either one of you feel free to answer this. For our audience who may not be aware, what is an intermediate unit?
So, all right, there's the Pennsylvania Department of Education, and we have 500 school districts across the Commonwealth. And there's 29 intermediate units in the middle. So we're about 50 years old, intermediate units are. And if you think back 50 years ago, you really were then this liaison between the Pennsylvania Department of Ed and the school district. So our Allegheny Intermediate Unit services the 42 school districts in Allegheny County around the city of Pittsburgh. We actually serve the most school districts of any intermediate unit in the Commonwealth. So you were this liaison, but you also, intermediate units did a ton of work meeting the needs of students who had IEPs. So sort of the advent of how do we organize schools differently to meet the needs of students. Schools weren't there yet. They didn't have their own internal capacity, so intermediate units often filled that void. But then every intermediate unit looks a little bit different because we try to meet the needs of our local community. So the history of intermediate units in terms of what, like the bread and butter of what we all provide is the same, but then each of us is a little bit different. So we do a lot of work here at this intermediate unit in community work with our family centers that we offer. We have an early childhood program, one of the largest providers years of Head Start and pre-K counts here in the region. Those are things that not every intermediate unit has. We also provide something called preschool early intervention. These are for students with special needs who aren't in kindergarten yet, so ages 3 to 5. We work with those students and their families. So it's really kind of unique what each IU does, but there's sort of this core work that we all do.
Mm. So in terms of the Allegheny Intermediate Unit and the services that it provides, how does the unit provide services for this diverse and vast body of students in Allegheny County?
Yeah, so we have almost 120,000 students in the 42 districts that we serve. And so what we do is we try to figure out, what do schools need of us? And so every school uses us a little bit differently. And so some utilize maybe more of our services than others. But we want to be able to be that resource that is specifically able to meet their needs. And so that's kind of the mindset that we have when we go into this. So it's a lot of professional development that we provide for teachers and educators in the region. It's the opportunities to have ROLA-like meetings where, the superintendents, we bring them together once a month, and you have business managers and you have curriculum directors, and these opportunities for folks to kind of learn together with one another each month, I think is really powerful. So this idea of this educational ecosystem that we try to sort of help cultivate here in Allegheny County is really sort of the work that we do here on a day-to-day basis.
Mm. So what does your day-to-day work look like as director?
So we have 1,200 employees who work in over 400 locations. So we're very sort of spread out throughout the county, but we have 130 programs that we offer. And so one part of my job is overseeing the organization and working with the different divisions and the folks who head those. But then another piece of my job is working directly with the superintendents, and trying to figure out what kind of supports do they need. There are some superintendents that I work with a little more closely than others. Maybe they're still relatively new in their roles. And then there's other superintendents that we'll meet from time to time, but they're much more experienced and kind of have things figured out. But that's sort of the way that I look at my role, sort of leading the organization, but then also working with the school leaders that represent our school districts.
Got you on that. Now, pivoting back to Nick, tell me about how you got involved with AIU.
Well, whenever I got hired as a teacher, so I graduated from Pitt with a degree in secondary social studies education, which means I was certified to teach any social studies class between grades 7 and 12. And that can include history, economics, government, political science, lots of different things. So like Bob, I actually got hired at the school where I graduated from. So you went back to Baldwin, Whitehall, and I went back to Shaler area. I don't think that was either of our plans when we were 14, 15 years old, but that's where we ended up. So whenever you get hired as a teacher, immediately you start to hear about these opportunities and you start to get the emails from the AIU. And inevitably you end up down here at some point in time. And if you walked around the hallways right now, you'd see there's just rooms full of teachers from all over the place. Mm-hmm. So as a social studies teacher, I started to come down here for different social studies days. They have a social studies symposium that is, there's presentations, there's a tabling event, and as you may or may not know, 42 different school districts, 42 different ways to teach social studies. Mm-hmm. Since it's not a tested subject like math or science, there's not like every single student from all these different school districts is graduating with a different experience of social studies education. So we try to make sure they get the basics. They're good citizens, they understand their civic responsibilities and their rights. They understand history, et cetera, et cetera.
I was going to ask, what objectivity should there be in social studies?
Well, so whenever I got hired, it used to be that really a major spoken expectation was citizenship education. Civics played a lot more of a role. And that means that when I was a 23-year-old teacher, it was my responsibility to make sure that students understood their civic rights and responsibilities. In addition to, I had a curriculum that I had to cover, right? So for me specifically, teachers teach many different classes, as everybody knows. Mm-hmm. So I was teaching American history at 3 different levels, so that's 3 different curriculum. And I was teaching world history, and then I ended up teaching some electives as well after the time went by. But basically, as an American history teacher, my obligation was make sure that you cover the content. We had a shared departmental assessments. So at the end of each unit, at the end of the midterm, the final, those were the same tests that every teacher gave. But in the middle of that, how you got to the end of that road differed for everybody. So as a ninth grade teacher, which is what I was hired as originally, it was my job to make sure these ninth graders understood the basics of like post-Civil War to the present American history, but also that they would take that history, the lessons of history, and they would apply it to their community. Mm-hmm. So moments where they would interview veterans of wars, moments where they would interview elected officials, from school board members to local politicians, that they could connect with opportunities to register to vote by the time they graduated from high school. So some of those basic responsibilities, but also service projects and volunteering. So it used to be, in the school where I was hired, which was Shaler area, it used to be a lot more formal. Then it became somewhat more informal, this idea that every senior needs to complete some kind of service project. And they started to work on that really whenever they got into high school, and the basics of what are you going to be expected to do before you graduate in your social studies classes. And it was some kind of effort that had an impact in the community in some way, shape, or form, whether it was organizing a soccer camp for young kids, or building park benches, or cleaning up North Park or Hartwood Acres, or maybe planning some other kind of educational program or opportunity. It was up to the students to help pick that, and that it was up to the teachers to support that. So if we fast forward a little bit to 2014, Pennsylvania passed something called Act 70 of 2014, which it was an effort to make sure that all graduating seniors had a basic understanding of the Holocaust, genocide, and human rights violations. So as a social studies teacher, I was one of the teachers that was in my school district that was sent to the AIU, because they said, hey, we got to have a bit more of a focus. We see that the Commonwealth is moving in this direction. It's not a mandate, it's not a requirement, but we know that there's more effort being put into making sure people have an understanding of the Holocaust, past and present genocides, and human rights violations. So the AIU started offering training. There was a couple people from the state who would come here, and social studies teachers could come here to learn from her. And she invited, the person I met, her name was Sally Flaherty, she invited the Holocaust Center of Pittsburgh and some other organizations, so that social studies teachers from across the region could kind of get best practices from the state, but also learn about the local nonprofits that could support the work of school districts. So as a social studies teacher, I started to see the power in helping my students connect with local nonprofits for really meaningful and rich community-based experiences. And then it evolved from there. So I'll pause.
So tell me about the Light Initiative and how that started.
So 2014 was my first example of, it's the first time I ever heard an administrator say the phrase quasi-unfunded mandate. And I didn't, you're laughing because you know exactly what I'm talking about. Act 70 was, it started out as a survey that intermediate units would complete with the help of superintendents, because remember, 500 different schools teaching social studies 500 different ways with the support of dozens of intermediate units. The question from the state was, is the Holocaust being taught? Is genocide being taught? Are human rights and human rights violations being taught? And in what capacity? So they created a survey, and this eventually resulted in years later, in a strong encouragement. So it's strongly encouraged. There's no test, it's not an official mandate. It's a strong encouragement that schools teach quality Holocaust, genocide, human rights education. So what I saw as this was all unfolding, as I was saying to my administration, we need to, they said, let's pump the brakes, bud. Like, this isn't a mandate. We have no money for this. There's no funding for us to turn our system upside down. They said in education, there's often changes, and we can't just turn on a dime. Bob taught me that some school districts are like battleships, where it takes a really long time for them to turn. And some school districts are much, much smaller. They're able to pivot very rapidly. All school districts are different. So what I saw was, this is a valuable program. I did feel that it was important for young people to get these three aspects of Act 70: Holocaust, genocide, human rights. I had met a Holocaust survivor and then a few more after he had passed away, and every time I brought them into my school, it was this undeniable experience. It was this unforgettable, transformative, profound moment that my young people were having, and I thought, this is valuable. I do want every student in Pennsylvania to have an experience that is this meaningful. And every time we started to talk about these difficult things, it would inevitably turn into, how can we prevent bullying in our school? How can we make our schools safer? How can we prevent hate speech from being accepted in our hallways, in our bathrooms, in our classrooms, in our lunchrooms? How can we make sure that students don't experience hate crimes? And if they do, that they know where and how to report them. They know where to get help. They know who is there to support. So I felt very strongly about the mission of this. But the rollout, I thought, man, if this were only like STEM or STEAM, science, tech, engineering, and math. Sometimes it's called STEAM if you add A as the art. Sometimes private schools add R, which is religion, and they call it STREAM. You know, this acronym I saw had a lot of power, because what it did is it brought everybody together to acknowledge, yeah, young people do need to know how to use technology. They do need to have a good understanding of science. They do need to have a strong foundation in math, et cetera, et cetera. And I thought, I started to ask, why is STEAM so successful, and why is this Act 70 stuff not as successful as STEAM? And I started to think about education just as a system, and it seems like in education there are, I don't want to oversimplify it, but oftentimes there's incentives and there's mandates. There's stuff you have to do and stuff that you can do if you have time. And I found that when you incentivize something in education, because I came to all these symposiums and tabling events, I thought, man, people were much more likely to look down that road and see, hey, maybe this does fit into my school, because, you want me to engage with these nonprofits, and you're going to cover school buses, you're going to provide lunch, you want us to go to the Carnegie Museums or Soldiers and Sailors or whatever. That's hard. There's a cost to that. Not every school can afford that, and if you pass that on to students, not every student's family can afford that. So the question became, how do you incentivize these really meaningful experiences? And then I started to think about what stands in the way of this. Well, for me and my experiences, to get a Holocaust survivor to come to my school, I had to have my school district pay for a substitute teacher. And then I had to get in my car in the school day, and I had to drive over to Squirrel Hill, pick up this man, drive him back to school. I had to set up the assembly, which I had never done before, so I didn't know how to do that. I had to set up the microphones for the program, which I had never done. I didn't even know how to turn on the lights in the auditorium. I had all of these different hurdles that I had to overcome, and it's not like there are people in schools just sitting around waiting to be asked to help out. Like, everybody is busy all the time in schools. So I didn't really have many people that I could turn to say, hey, can you pick this person up? Or, hey, can you cover this cost? Because as I started to get into field trips, it gets expensive. Taking students to Washington, D.C., to the Holocaust Museum or the African American History Museum, or, to see the monuments, that's thousands of dollars, thousands and thousands of dollars, because you can't take a school bus. You got to take a coach bus. You have to feed the kids. There's a lot of costs associated with all this. And so what I did was I started to think about, in my classroom, in my school, how could I kind of flip the script here a little bit, also acknowledging that many of the folks I was bringing in related to World War II and the Holocaust, because I was an American history teacher, and even my Korean War vets, Vietnam vets, they were not getting any younger. And the question became, how do we put students into leadership roles? How do we get students to bring their stories in? How do we get students to step into their role as storytellers? Because it's their grandparents and their great-grandparents who hold these stories. How do we get students to help coordinate and plan some of these experiences so that they benefit them? That's the co-design process, right? If they're supposed to be the end users of these programs, how can we get them as part of the process of designing them? So all this came together in me thinking of a lighthouse metaphor, of the health of I heard someone say this once, the health of a school is a direct reflection of the health of the community. And the communities oftentimes look to their schools to think, how's my community doing? And they look to their schools sometimes to guide them. So I started to think about a school as a beacon, like a lighthouse, that promotes safe and compassionate communities. And then I started to think about, all right, what if I create my acronym? What can Lighthouse stand for? And I came into my classroom the next day and I said to my students, what do you think? Because at this time I was teaching juniors and seniors in a Holocaust, genocide, human rights elective. And they said, that's way too long.
I'm glad we came
like,
to
this
that
is dumb.
realization.
And I said, well, I think, what if it's like a light? And I, came in at a later date and talking to some friends and stuff, I said, I think I got a logo. And they said, that looks like Duquesne Light. You're going to get sued. This is ridiculous. And so I started to ask myself, what does it take to create an educational program? And it's got to be something pretty simple. So I came up with the acronym of LIGHT, which stands for Leadership Through Innovation, because that is a popular word in education. Leadership through innovation in genocide and human rights teaching. And that genocide and human rights is Act 70. So this was my effort to incentivize Act 70 by supporting educators on their quest to inspire, prepare, and empower the next generation of humanitarians. And that's when it gets taken down to its cores. At the end of the day, really quality social studies education produces human beings that want to help other human beings and that want to give back to their community and that want to be engaged, that want to be part of their democracy and support and help. So the other piece of this that inspire, prepare, empower, that is what I identified as a really effective learning style that all of my guest speakers seemed to do. So every time I would bring in somebody with a lived experience of something, usually something traumatic like war or genocide or hate crime or something, what they would always do, without saying it, is in the first couple minutes they would inspire people with their story. And it wasn't just their story of trauma, it was their story of healing, their story of resilience, their story of love and hope. And then they would transition into this phase of their talk, which was almost like a preparation phase of they were getting the young people ready and the teachers as well to talk about this and to take ownership of it. They were going through this process of handing their story to someone else to be part of someone else's story. And the last piece of it was there was always some kind of call to action. Of okay, you cannot prevent X, Y, and Z, but you can do this thing in your school, and it's your responsibility, it's your obligation. And Holocaust survivors often use that word. They would say it's your obligation to make a safer community, to stand up to hate in all of its forms, to protect one another. And that's whenever I started to think, all right, at the end of the day, what I'm just trying to do is I'm trying to inspire, prepare, and empower humanitarians. And that's what Act 70 of 2014 was seeking to do as well. But I thought, what, maybe there's some local foundations and organizations that want to help. And the question was, do we directly help students or do we directly help teachers, directly help educators? And we decided on our direct intervention would be supporting educators, whether they're nonprofit educators, classroom educators. Sometimes you've got a lot of folks in schools that they educate, but they don't have a roster. They don't have tests and quizzes and lesson plans. So you've got social workers and librarians and principals and superintendents and school psychologists. And then you have foundations that also have this incredible mission of education. And so you've got educators working for foundations. You've got educators working for nonprofits. You've got educators working for schools, but none of them necessarily are designed to effectively work with one another. Mm-hmm. So Light sits in the middle of all three of those. And it was originally fiscally sponsored by the Holocaust Center and the Jewish Federation of Greater Pittsburgh to be a new way of looking at educational outreach to transform Holocaust remembrance into education and advocacy for all different marginalized groups of people. And then in 2018, everything changed in Pittsburgh because that was the year of the Pittsburgh synagogue shooting at the Tree of Life that affected 3 congregations, Dor Hadash, New Light, and Tree of Life, killed 11 people, the deadliest act of anti-Semitism in American history. And when that happened, a lot of different groups of people of all ages were looking for a way to better support educators to teach what we often describe as these difficult subjects. The conversation that no one wants to have that is part of social studies. No one wants to talk about hate crimes. No one wants to talk about racism. No one wants to talk about marginalization, Islamophobia, homophobia, like all these different ways that people are brought down. But it is an essential part of civics education that young people figure out how to work through these difficult conversations and figure out how to support one another, figure out how to be allies for one another in this quest to create safer, kinder communities to prevent things like the October 27, 2018 shooting. So following that, Tree of Life, the synagogue was closed, and a group of community leaders, educators, foundation leaders, a lot of different people, victims, family members, survivors, they created a new nonprofit organization called Tree of Life. And they decided, we're going to make a memorial, we're going to make a museum, we're going to make an education center, we're going to rebuild a space of worship and community, and we are going to help anyone in the country, maybe anyone in the world eventually, to better understand how to turn acts of hate and tragedy and trauma into resilience and healing and love and community building. And for that, Light was officially handed over to Tree of Life and the organization. And as part of that, Bob and I were working with an organization called the Eradicate Hate Global Summit, which was it's the largest anti-hate convening in the world that is held in remembrance of the Tree of Life synagogue shooting, the Pittsburgh synagogue shooting. So that started a year or two after the attack, and Bob and I and another a superintendent from South Allegheny, Dave McDonald, we identified that really if you're going to have this global effort in Pittsburgh to combat hate, you need young people at the table because they are arguably the most important piece of this puzzle. And so Bob and I and Dave were figuring out how to bring young people together, and it resulted in the Eradicate Hate Student Summit, which I'm sure we'll get to eventually, and that led me to coming on board the Allegheny Intermediate Unit because there's a lot of need from every school district to create opportunities for civic engagement, K through 12. And there's a lot of need for us to continue healing from what happened here in Pittsburgh and what's happened, unfortunately, all over the world. And so we know that there's an international effort toward what is called peace-building education. In Pittsburgh, it's kind of fallen under the category of anti-hate education because we had a hate crime, a deadly hate crime, to the scale of in a specific community that had never been seen before. So for the Jewish community, the work has expanded to how can we all come together and help any individual in Pittsburgh feel safer, more supported, and how can we bring young people together in their efforts to make safer, kinder, more compassionate schools and communities? Very long answer to a
very
question.
Good, in-depth, thorough answer.
A lot of pieces.
Now, let me ask you this. Beginning your career as a teacher, now I guess transitioning to a more admin role, was it difficult being less hands-on?
Oh, yeah, of course. I mean, teaching is a job that every single day you're going to hear something you've never heard before, good and bad, funny, not funny. You're going to hear it all every day. Every day is different. Every day is exciting. Every day you wake up and you realize, like, I have all these plans, and by the end of the day, they will all have changed. And I will have new anecdotes, and I will have new experiences, and I will grow, and I will become a better teacher because I'm probably going to fail at 20 things today, and I'm going to succeed at 21 things, and I'm going to keep throwing myself back into the fold. And so whenever you're in a classroom, you're managing, for me specifically, I was managing groups of students ages 14 to 18. And you have to keep in mind that a big part of education school is adolescent psychology because they are not fully formed human beings yet. As we talk, their prefrontal cortex is
25.
Yeah, that hits at 25. That's why they're only allowed to start renting cars at 25. However, so insurance companies acknowledge they're not adults till they're 25, but they like to think they're adults whenever they're they all hit it at different ages, right? So we got some 17 and 18-year-olds that I would lend my car keys, like, in back in the day, but I never did that. But then you've got some other 18-year-olds, and you think, like, oh my goodness, you got at least 7 more years, 7 more years till I would trust you with anything. So managing groups of students, you become a bit of an artist as a teacher, for sure, an artist and an entertainer, because you have to think, in the 42 minutes that I have these students, how can I make this subject engaging that they might not have any direct connection to whatsoever? And sometimes it's goofy and funny, and there's games, and there's that sort of thing, and sometimes it's a heck of a lot more serious. So over the years, I went from teaching American history to specifically spending my full day teaching Holocaust, genocide, and human rights. And when you're teaching the Holocaust, the U.S. Holocaust Memorial Museum in D.C. puts out a list of guidelines, and one of the guidelines is there is no room for simulations and games, and you can make it engaging and meaningful, but you do have to take it seriously. So then the question becomes, how do I make sure I'm creating an environment that is not just trauma-informed, but is healing-centered? Because if I got 42 minutes, and I have a group of students where they're coming from gym class, math class, English class, they're coming from lunch. Some of them are just getting to school after a dentist appointment. They're all coming from these different headspaces, and I have to take them safely in to incredibly difficult and graphic and traumatic content. And then I have to take them safely out in a way every day for 180 days that makes them feel like this is something they can cope with. This is something that will help them practice resilience and healing. But it's also that we can't sugarcoat it. Like we can't deny the wrongs of the past. Or in Maya Angelou's words, history, despite its wrenching pain, cannot be unlived, but if faced with courage, need not be lived again. For the record, I do not have notes for people listening at home. What I did, like any smart teacher, is I taped that to the wall and I looked at it every day. Every teacher has something like that. You look at it every day to remind yourself, that you're in this to make sure that we don't repeat these terrible mistakes of the past. So managing young people quickly for me switched over to a world where I was teaching full time, but I was also writing grants. I was starting to plan a lot more field trips for other schools, for other communities within the Allegheny Intermediate Unit and also in surrounding counties. So it's shifted into this project management mentality. But I would make an argument that pretty much every effective teacher I've ever met has incredibly high executive functioning skills. They can do a little bit of everything. Because if they can't, then they fail. Because the students will eat them alive. So we learn how to adapt, we learn how to think on the fly, we learn how to manage small budgets, we learn how to manage paperwork, because you can't lose kids' tests, you can't mess up their grades, so you have to get really good at crossing all the T's and dotting all the I's. So it's really, I think that any effective educator could be a really effective manager of people, because that's what educators do, is they have to go into a room full of people with a lot of different backgrounds and a lot of different mindsets, and we have to bring everybody together for this meaningful shared experience. And then we also have to send them on their separate ways and help them step into their own individual power, which is hard to do. So we have to kind of do it all as a group, but also focus on the individual. And we have to manage this across, most teachers are teaching 6 different classes a day. Sometimes it's 6 completely different subjects a day. So for me, it's been a really natural, enjoyable role to do almost 20 years in the classroom and then shift to this kind of event management, project management, in bringing large groups of students together in a really short amount of time to have them have a shared experience. Because what we learned is that an educator at Baldwin, actually, Mr. Dan Shaner, veteran teacher, he said to us, in all my years of teaching, I brought my students on 1 million field trips, and they competed against students in 1 million different ways. But he said, until I stumbled upon light, I never realized that students could come together to collaborate across school district boundaries. So that's our goal, is to enhance collaboration and community building, all in the spirit of humanitarianism, with our Pittsburgh-based role models guiding us, our Rachel Carsons and our Roberto Clementes and those folks.
Beautiful. Now, To close off this first section, 2 more questions for the both of you. Both of you being fathers, how did that impact how you do your day-to-day now, either as an educator or as a manager? How has fatherhood shaped that experience?
I think it was interesting as a teacher. Early in my career, you kind of think that your content, what you're teaching, your class is the most important, right? And if it was, assigning assignments over the holidays or things like that, it's important. And then you become a parent and you realize there are a lot of other things going on in that kid's life. There's family dynamics, there's maybe siblings, there's all the other things outside of my class. And I think it just makes it changes your perspective, and you understand that, yes, this is important, but it's one important thing among many important things. So I think that's one thing. And I think it's, what's also helped me is just in your approach to people, right? Because when you're a parent, you can get frustrated with a student as a teacher. You can get frustrated with a staff member as an administrator. And you could say, well, I just wish, they would go away and I could get someone else. You can't do that with kids, right? So you're mentally, you start to put yourself in a different place. Like, I've got to figure this out. And so as an educator, I've got to figure this student out, because I can't throw away a student, right? That obviously is the wrong thing to do, but what do I need to do to really kind of impact that child? And that might be the one thing that I need to focus on for weeks on end, just to crack that get inside and understand how I can build a relationship with that kid. And I think that really changed my perspective as an educator when you see it through the eyes of a parent and realize I've got to figure out how to make this work. I can't just push it off to the side.
And that's one of the strengths of the system that we have in Pennsylvania, keeping in mind that every state is different, right? So our system in Pennsylvania, having the intermediate units, the Allegheny Intermediate Unit is able to maintain and nurture relationships with teachers, acknowledging that the teachers are taking their time to build and manage and nurture relationships with students. So if we, as AIU employees, can support our educators, they can better support their students. So as a teacher, again, before I had kids, my balance was most certainly off. It was very, very off. Because I thought, like, social studies. I mean, why did I become a social studies teacher? Because it's the most important subject on the face of the planet, and nothing is math? Are you kidding me? But then as you get older, you realize, like, oh wait, we do want them to be well-balanced human beings, and if they can't do math, they can't do anything. And if they don't understand social studies, they also can't do anything. But English is important too, and so is science, and that, family and consumer science. Like, if they can't, like, cook a meal, then they can't even stay alive. So, like, these things are all important, but there's not enough time for everything. So when I became a parent, that's whenever you realize, like, oh, there's not time for anything. So you're always on borrowed time, and you really do have to try to find that balance and trust the process and trust the systems. And it's really hard to do that, to let go and know that, all right, I can't do all these different things, so I just have to do my best at the thing that I'm doing and trust that all of these other people and that the system is set up in a way to support students. And coming over to the AIU now, as I'm a relatively new employee here, it's fascinating to see the other side too. And it's also amazing how quickly you start to forget what it was like to walk into a classroom every day, and we're just doing different stuff. Like, I'll think about reaching out to a teacher at like 5 o'clock because I'm still working at 5 o'clock. And the teacher sometimes hits me up back and they say, are you kidding, dude? I've been home for 2.5 hours. Like, what are you doing? Or they'll text me at like 6 in the morning and they're like, I'm at school already. know? So, like, there is a different system because, this whole it takes a village mentality, I think, is what, as I get older, I'm sure as Bob gets older too, is you realize, like, that is not a joke. Like, it is true. It does take a village, and we all have to play some kind of a role in it, and we can't give up or quit, because at the end of the day, everybody is somebody's kid.
Now, to close off this first section, the question I asked every single guest that comes on: what is the best possible life advice you could pass on to the people watching and listening?
I got mine if you need it.
You go. Then
Well,
I'll
I'm
think.
going to cheat.
Okay.
So, because we're in the Fred Rogers room
There you go.
at the Allegheny Intermediate Unit, and I'm looking at a picture of Fred Rogers with a trolley. I'm looking at the puppets. I see Daniel Tiger where I am. And Mr. Rogers had a famous quote. There are 3 ways to ultimate success, I believe he said. Number 1,
Be kind.
number 2,
Be kind.
and number 3,
Be kind.
it's the best advice I've ever heard.
I think, yeah, I'll piggyback on that. I think the understanding of how you can impact how other people feel. Never take that for granted, because you can be that difference in that person's life in that moment, and sometimes don't even realize it. But this idea of no one wants to be with people that just walk around grumpy all day. No one wants to be with someone who's, constantly sarcastic and just doesn't make them feel good. But if you're able to make people feel good, that doesn't mean you still don't have difficult conversations, but you honor them. You honor who they are. You understand that they have life goals as well. So what can you do to help support that? And I think that's something that I think is really, really important. It's something I hope I don't forget, but I think sometimes we have to always check yourself and okay, right now, the way I just handled that situation is not the way I want to handle it. So I think that advice for people is just to make sure that you understand the power you have, not hierarchical power, just power that you have with the people that you interact with on a day-to-day basis.
I think both of your advice ties heavily into this week's topic of empathy, but we will be getting to that after this week's Artist Spotlight. For this week's Haven Artist Spotlight, we will be playing the song Backseat by Mr. Doctor. I hope that y'all enjoy. Hope y'all enjoyed this week's Haven Artist Spotlight, Backseat by Mr. Doctor. You'll be able to find them at Haven this Saturday. So if you go to the description of wherever you're watching or listening, you'll find a link for the Haven Music Venue where you can get your tickets so you can find Mr. Doctor live this weekend. Again, that's Backseat by Mr. Doctor. The artist links will be in the description whether you're watching or listening. Now, for this week's social issue, we are talking on the topic of empathy. Now, we sort of came to this conclusion of doing this topic as we did meet at the Eradicate Hate Global Summit. Now, how does that summit fit into spreading empathy across the community?
Yeah, I think Nick talked a little bit about it before in terms of the purpose of the student summit, right? And what we were trying to do to impact young people. And so I'll focus maybe on the young people, but also the adults that are there as well. But this idea of how do you turn tragedy into something positive? And I think that really is the essence of the way we approach the student summit. This idea of how can you put yourself in someone else's shoes? How do you how might you be able to feel that type of pain that they're feeling? How might you be able to feel the way that the community responded in such a positive way across different faiths, across different racial communities? It just was really powerful to see how Pittsburgh came together around that. So this idea of how did those activities build this empathetic sort of response, so that we can all create this sort of kinder, more compassionate world that we want to be a part of? Relationships matter, and I think effective relationships have everything to do with, how are you empathetic towards the people that you're trying to build those relationships with?
Yeah, I think it's important to note that there have been many, many acts of violence, identity-based violence, identity-based hatred that have led to violence over generations of American history. In my lifetime, and in the lifetime of the folks that organized the Eradicate Hate Global Summit, that's former Chancellor of Pitt, Mark Nordenberg, and Laura Ellsworth, a partner at Jones Day Law Firm. Those two were the two that really sparked this global summit. None of us had seen a response to an act of violence like the response that Pittsburgh saw in the Stronger Than Hate campaign. So every day, as we know in America, there are shootings, there's violence, but every day there's not this community response. So it became a question. Why was Pittsburgh different? Why did Pittsburgh generate the Stronger Than Hate campaign where other cities, other communities hadn't done that? What was it that existed in Pittsburgh that laid the foundation, to lay the foundation for groups of people coming together in a way that was really beautiful and hopeful? And what we saw is that we had a long history, going back to the beginning where we talk about unions, right? Where people came to Pittsburgh for many, many years from all different places all over the world, and also from all over America. And Pittsburgh, as we know, became this melting pot, this multicultural landscape. And because of that, people had to learn how to live together, had to learn how to take care of one another. And even, in the mills and in the mines, like, people literally had to keep each other alive. And so after generations of that mentality of looking out for one another despite our differences, I guess it shouldn't have surprised us that after the Pittsburgh synagogue shooting, our community would come together in an unbelievable, powerful way, and in a way that inspired other communities and other people all over the world to say, hey, we need to make sure that we're all looking out for one another. We're not just looking out for ourselves. We are at a time where humanity could just use a little bit more love for one another. And what we saw is that the Stronger Than Hate campaign, it was like, how do we capture that lightning in a bottle? And the Eradicate Hate Global Summit was the effort of saying, hey, we know that what is happening right now in Pittsburgh is special. In 2019, 2020, 2021, even during COVID, people were still finding ways to digitally come together to do this work. So the question became, how do we sustain this? How do we capture this in a way that we can be piloting new approaches to creating safer communities? And that's what we're doing. So the first couple student summits, we were actually tasked with creating a playbook. So the Allegheny Intermediate Unit produced a playbook for other cities to be able to do student convenings that would promote opportunities where students from all across a region could come together and say, what are you facing in your school district? This is what I am facing in my school district. What solutions do you have for what you're facing? These are the solutions that we've come up with for what we are facing. Would you like to do a program together? Could I come to your school? Would you like to come to my school? And we saw some of this was happening before the summit. Like Woodland Hills had a leadership summit after Antoine Rose was murdered, and Antoine Rose Jr. And the Woodland Hills Summit is a really great example of what potential there was in Pittsburgh to bring all these different communities together. And so, they now participate in the Eradicate Hate Global Summit, but now there's lots more school districts that are starting to plan these smaller kind of mini summits to bring young people together to just say, hey, we're all in this together.
Yeah. And I think when you talk about empathy, one of the things that was really interesting is when we had the first student summit, we rooted a lot of the work that we did with young people around the stories from the Tree of Life, Repairing the World, Stories from the Tree of Life. Sorry, I said that correctly. But it was a documentary built around the response to the shooting. And what we wondered was, okay, we're bringing all of these students together from a variety of diverse school districts. What is their reaction going to be, right? Because the story is centered around anti-Semitism. And what we saw from an empathy standpoint is we saw students who were not Jewish, who didn't have the same skin color, but seeing themselves and some of their life experiences in that documentary. And that was powerful because the empathy that they felt really was the seeing themselves in a very different way, but reflected in that documentary. And I think that was really powerful because we weren't sure. We really weren't sure how that was, and that's the essence of the whole Eradicate Hate work. While it's rooted in what occurred in the anti-Semitic, attack, but we're also talking about racism. We're also talking about gender identity. We're talking about how do we make sure that everybody has a sense of belonging, regardless of their background, regardless of their life experiences. And I think that's something that was really powerful, that hit us. It was great to see that the students could sort of step outside themselves in a way that had impact and power on them, because they were crying. They were crying at the end of the film, and that's something that spoke to them, and we were really interested to see that from an empathetic standpoint.
And another important piece of this is we invited the survivors and victims' family members to witness it. And the students in the first year just naturally started to identify, oh, you're in the documentary, and they started to interact with them. And then that led to invitations where schools began inviting some of these survivors and victims' family members to come to their school. So we only had 10 students and 2 chaperones from each school attending Eradicate Hate, but they were acting as ambassadors of their school district. And what we started to see play out is an overwhelming number of invitations for these survivors and victims' family members to go to all these different schools and communities and to share their story and to just connect, to share their lived experience. And students, again, they saw themselves in these survivors and victims' family members. And what you see is, you see tears in the audience, of course, when the students are learning about this in the prepare phase of it, right? But in the empower phase, at the end of it, what you see smiles, you see hugs. You see really beautiful moments happening where the students aren't leaving depressed, they're leaving motivated, they're leaving called to action, they're feeling valued and seen, maybe for the first time, because they see themselves in this story, and they see that Pittsburgh is a community that has their backs and that's going to take care of them if something bad happens. So we think about this. Empathy is a really important step to not just to response, but also to prevention and to healing. So it's that full circle effect.
My next question was actually going to be about prevention. Now, this is a very loaded question. And I guess in terms of why hate-filled violence occurs, a lot of it is because people feel left out. They feel unseen, unheard. The vast majority of violence is carried out by men, and being educators, being able to sculpt the young men of the future, how do you cultivate a sense of belonging to prevent things like this from happening in the future?
I think empathy is modeled, right? And I think that when you're working with young people, you can talk about being empathetic, but they have to see it in action. And I think those relationships then that the adults build with the young people is just so critically important. And you're right, when you look at a lot of the things that have occurred over time in sort of this area of hate, the folks that carry out those atrocities, often you can point back to things where it didn't go well for them, or people saw something but they didn't act, right? And so this idea of how are we ensuring that every student is seen and is heard, because then if there's a change in behavior, if there's a situation that just doesn't look right, that we have those relationships that are strong enough peer to peer, but also adult to student, where we can maybe get in front of it and prevent it.
So I think what Bob talked about was really important, is effective role modeling, right? And we know that as educators, whether we work in a school, a nonprofit, a foundation, another type of organization, it's really important to be as good of a role model as you could possibly be. the Allegheny Intermediate Unit and all intermediate units exist to model best practices in education. But what you get when you get this this kind of like third-party moment, like the Eradicate Hate Global Summit, is you get educators and students and foundation folks and nonprofit folks and all sorts of different people learning from global change makers, and being able to connect a young person to a global change maker. That's a pretty incredible moment, because then they get to meet new role models. They get to see themselves a little bit in the future. They get to have a more future-oriented mindset, is the phrase, where they're seeing hope for the future. They're seeing themselves in these different careers and professions. They're seeing themselves as, to borrow from Mr. Rogers, as helpers in many different spaces. But I think it all comes back to, for the work that we do with young people, belonging. When young people have a sense of belonging in their schools, we know that it leads to a million different positive outcomes. We know that whenever they feel like they belong in that school, they're more likely to show up to school. We know that chronic absenteeism goes down, truancy goes down, because they feel like that is their space and they are welcome there. They can bring their whole selves into that space. They feel safe there. They feel like they belong. And we know that whenever they're in school, it's much easier to apply all of the different successful and proven interventions to help them in any way that they need help. And we know that that results in higher graduation rates, that results in better test scores, students being able to follow through on their dreams and whatever they want to do in the future. So having that sense of empathy is a critical step to being able to feel a sense of belonging and help others feel a sense of belonging. Because at the end of the day, we aren't in the hallways with students. We aren't in the cafeteria sitting at their lunch tables. They have to see what it takes to create a sense of belonging for other students, whether they like them or not, so that everyone can feel safe and welcome walking into a space, and that is necessary for the conditions that create successful learning.
So then let me ask this. With both of you being fathers, both of you raising children, and being able to imbue empathy into your children's lives, how does it differ between teaching empathy at home and teaching empathy in the classroom?
My children I drive them crazy because they're like, you're teaching. I'm like, yeah, I'm teaching. Of course I'm teaching. You can take a teacher out of a classroom, but you can't, you can't take the teacher out of the human being. So, I mean, it's, I would say that maybe our roles as classroom teachers and then kind of educational leaders in some capacity, it's just given us more experience, more exposure to like all these different moments that other people haven't necessarily seen. Because whenever you're a teacher, every single teacher, every single educator, you're exposed to a lot of different situations that are completely different from what you grew up with, completely different from what you expect, and you see the best of the best and you see the worst of the worst, but at the end of the day, you got to teach them all. You don't get to choose. You got all of them. And it's your responsibility to help in whatever way you can get those young people to the next stage, to the next step, in a way that they feel supported. And part of that, at least for the work that we're doing, is making sure that young people meet individuals with lived experience of the best, but also of the worst. And what we've seen is that when they meet individuals who have direct lived experience with violence, with traumatic violence, with hate-based violence, we see that if done well, and it's hard to do it well, if you're intentional and if you put a lot of time and effort into it, and if you're very careful about it, students will leave those experiences not just with a sense of empathy, but with a call to action, and they will leave feeling more healed. So it would be very easy to introduce new trauma. It's very difficult to introduce hope and healing, but when done well, we're seeing and we're starting to be able to measure that's essential for an effective democracy, for society. It's not just voting. It's so much more than that. And meeting individuals with all these different lived experiences, and of, the simplest way to say this is, and feeling like you've walked a mile in their shoes, it helps you to understand that basic golden rule of treat others as you wish to be treated. And that's not just accidentally found, like that is taught. Yeah. And it's up to us to model that and to teach it.
Yeah, I think the modeling, we keep going back to that. I think it's a consistent theme. I think the other piece of it is active listening, I think with your own kids, but also young people that you work with. Because sometimes we discount student voice, right? And you really need to understand what a student is trying to convey, and you can't do that unless you actively listen, and you ask for clarification, and you really try to sort of deepen that knowledge and understanding of that young person a little bit. I think that's really important. So I think when you model active listening, you are then teaching young people how to do the same on their end.
Mm. So I guess to close off this topic, what advice could you give to educators who are struggling or feel overwhelmed about incorporating empathy and belonging into their curriculums?
Well, I think in education, I'm really glad to see this. Throughout my career, early on, it was so much of an emphasis on content, right? We have to cover the content. You have to know the content. And I think what we have seen in education, and it's a very good thing, is this idea of how do we focus on each individual student, right? And what does that student need? Yes, content is important. Yes, there are things that we have to teach, but you're teaching people, and how do you get to know the people, and how do you build those relationships? I think that's incredibly important, because if you don't know your students, not just as learners, but as human beings, it's really hard to connect with them. And so I'm really glad to see more of that. The strategies that we're sharing with educators now that might look a little bit different, because that idea of human flourishing, like really how are we ensuring that child is going to become the best version of themselves, and what can we do to help support that?
There's a man who's been doing this work in Pittsburgh for decades. His name's Greg Dietz, and he worked with the University of Pittsburgh. That's why I'm throwing his name out there, another Pitt guy. And he taught the Light team this phrase of process versus product. And I think that at the end of the day, all of this modeling is, we want our young people, our educators, all of our community members to understand that learning is a process. It's not a product. Teaching is a process. It's not a product. It's something that we want to make sure that our students see that that the adults in their lives, we hope that they're talking about volunteering, that they're talking about being actively civically engaged, that we're talking about protecting other people's human rights, and they're modeling that, and they're showing that this is not just a K through 12 process, this is a lifetime process. Learning never stops, and teaching also never stops. So hopefully our young people can step into this role, and everyone can step into the role of educator, and can see themselves, can find their way to help. And a Holocaust survivor once said it pretty simply to a group of students I was with. They said, why do you do this? Why are you continuing to share the worst story that ever happened to you in your entire life? And he said, I don't do this to be depressed. I do this to be hopeful. He said, because it's all about helping. He said, his exact quote was, I have an obligation to lead a life that is useful to my community. And that was his call to action to students. He said, I don't care what you do. Make sure it's useful to your community. Like this podcast is useful to your community. The work that you'll be doing after you graduate, useful to your community. The work that Bob and I do and everyone at the intermediate, it's useful. And really, we just want to model that and show students that there's no right way, single right way to be useful to your community. But if you're not careful, you might find the wrong way, which is that you're not actually giving back. And we want everyone to give back in some way, shape, or form, no matter what career they go down, no matter what path they follow. It just has to be something that everyone sees that they all play a role in their democracy, in their society, in their community.
That's a strong point to leave off on. Is there anything else that you guys want to get across to the audience?
No, I appreciate you elevating this idea of teaching empathy, because I think it's incredibly important. And the fact that you're covering it in your podcast, I think, is really positive. So appreciate you asking us to be a part of it today.
I appreciate you guys' time, and it's not just important. I think it's underrated. I think that almost every aspect of life can be tied back directly to how you treat others and how you think of others. No. So for the people watching and listening in our audience, if they would like to contact or be involved at the AIU, what channel should they go through?
So AIU3.net is our website. It gives you a little bit more around what we do here. You can also find on the website contact information for Nick and I. But I think that understand maybe a little bit more about what an IU does. For some people, they just don't know. One of your first questions was a good one. But then also, because we've talked a lot about it today, the Eradicate Hate Student Summit. If they go to the Eradicate Hate website, there's a lot of really good information about how we can hopefully start to change the dynamic, so we're not always sort of in repair mode, but we really are trying to be a little more proactive in anti-hate education, et cetera.
So all resources will be put in the description for everybody to get their hands on. This has been another incredible episode of the Let's Talk Socialization podcast. Thank you so much for your time. Very much appreciate us being able to get this together. I'm your host, Ian Kahinde, and we will see you next week for the season finale. Peace out, y'all.